Cy Cantarell, welcome to the finale of What Rough Beast.
The last episode.
But it's good news. It's good news. It's like a why more long live the king. The king is dead, long live the king. So What Rough Beast is dead, long live Omnishambles, which is going to rise like the phoenix from the idea of What Rough Beast, which we still are committed to, but it is now much more broadly conceived. And this is the final episode under the name What Rough Beast. It will soon be Omnishambles with a broader mandate. Is that fair?
Mm-hmm. That's fair. Omnishambles. So for those of you who may not be familiar with that term, it is a 2012 term that originated from a British TV show called The Thick of It, which I have not personally watched, but I have seen the elevator scene that was the origination point for this term. But it basically means something that is a complete disaster. So I think when we moved from the original Yeats quotation of What Rough Beast, Yeats talks about the widening gyre where the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Sidebar that John Gans recently called this the most overquoted poem in creation. It's, the problem is it's perfect for this time period. I think we got the idea that the widening gyre had actually encompassed pretty much the entire world at this point, that things were omnishambles. The disaster is so widespread that it almost seems universal. Mm-hmm. And, the thing that you and I both struggle with in our conversations together, try to do, and in our work try to do, is to pick apart what looks like something huge, opaque, and really frightening, and get inside of it, explain how it got to be that way, and then what we might even be able to do to make it better, or to even just change it in the future, or what that change might start to look like. So that is what we thought, hey, why not just make that the focus of the show, full stop.
Yeah, I'm so happy about it. Just a word to say for the Yeats poem before we let it return to its place as, I don't know if it's the most quoted, but it's certainly the most overmined for titles. It's like we have an extractive ideology when it comes to the second coming, which is the name of the poem. Part of the reason I started to feel squeamish about it, even though it's a beautiful poem, is that it ends with What Rough Beast. It's our come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. I love the expression, it's our come round at last. I love the idea that something will be reborn, and it'll be a number of contingencies that come together to create more ecstatic, more humane ways of living. I can almost bring myself to tears with Yeats's idea, but it was fundamentally a conservative idea. So losing the center that couldn't hold, and losing the falconer, losing the voice of the falconer, was really losing some kind of God in his matrix. And he did have fascist leanings, and he wanted to restore something, and that restoration would come in the form of the second coming of Christ. And this is not an ideology that we want to get too close to, especially because, as we're going to be talking about next episode, this idea of the second coming is informing a lot of very bad policy and destruction right now. So I think we want to put Yeats back in his place, and also think more panoramically about what these shambles are. So we've always talked about what could be built from the rubble. And I love the idea of shambles, and I love the idea of taking one shambles each time. But I should save this for the premiere of Omnishambles. We are now talking about the grand finale of What Rough Beast. And what I would hold on to from that poem is not the rough beast. Stephen Metcalf, the earlier co-host, used to say that think the What Rough Beast might be Donald Trump, right? He might be some kind of second coming that we're here for. And he certainly is occupying the space of what came next, or the fulfillment of some kind of generalized longing, if not prophecy. I didn't like to think that. I liked to think that the rough beast, it's our come round at last, might be something more hopeful. That's what I would want to hold on to, is that the rough beast, or the what is next, the vision for a more ecstatic, more humane way of living, might look different than we think it's going to look. It might
It
come from a
will. I
it
mean, there's no
will.
question. It's going to
That's
look
it.
different. And you cannot have order but to have disorder for it to emerge out of and vice
Yeah,
versa. So it's kind of like they're probably many rough beasts. Like it's
that's
not
it.
just one.
Right.
We have to understand the omnishambles in order to understand the rough beasts that are going to come from the omnishambles. So
That's it. That's it. Just one small other preview of a show we'll be doing is about the New Mexico Truth Commission. You were talking about possibilities of future reform, ruggedizing systems against assaults on them like this one. Ruggedization is a word taken from ecological preparation, climate refugees, so that these kind of things never happen again. And New Mexico has launched a truth commission. I think it's the first in the country. While Trump is still in power, a truth commission devoted to uh, actually documenting and preventing historical denialism about what has happened in our period. That would seem to be one of the first steps. They're starting with Jeffrey Epstein, but they clearly have Donald Trump in their sights too. And also thinking toward reform, thinking toward getting real documentation of what's happening now. Sometimes we lose the thread of all the shambles. So we want
I
to be
mean,
part of
we
that.
can't
Yeah.
help but lose it, right?
We
This is
can't. It,
this is like the labyrinth that I was talking to you about, even with the Epstein files.
yeah.
You have to pick out one thread, and then you follow that around, and it's very difficult to keep that 30,000 foot view in your mind. But you sort of have to like zoom out and zoom in, depending
Yeah.
on the narrative, to find where these systems connect to the other system. So,
Yes. And sometimes if it's too much, if it's omni shambles, if your systems are all flooded, just yet
mhm.
another one example that I keep thinking of is that there are still hundreds of unfound children who were separated from their families during Trump's first term, who are
I mean,
simply
there's so
trying
many different things.
to live their
Yeah.
lives, right? And it's something you can easily lose track of. It was an atrocity that happened, and that any kind of truth commission is going to be documenting these atrocities and not losing track of them. But there's so many, and it's an omni shambles. That's why we call it omni shambles. That it can start to be denied entirely. So it can be everything. If it's everything, then it can be nothing, and that's where denialism could come in. So that's, I think, something that we're taking pains to forestall by getting some of these things into the record, and making sure at least that we do our part to contribute to a living document with this podcast. Maybe that's ambitious, but that says this is what happened. This is what we saw. This is what happened in real time. These are some parts of it that point to what reform and reconstruction might look like.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's Omni Shambles, but this is the end of What Rough Beast, and we have a great guest for it today. Someone that we both know from previous lives. I think you're going to connect with him and tell him exactly how you know him. Siva Vaidyanathan, he's got a chair at my alma mater, the University of Virginia. He's the Robertson Professor of Media Studies. He's just a real polymath. He's written anti-social media about how Facebook undermines democracy. He's written an introduction to intellectual property for Oxford University Press. And he wrote a book that you worked on called The Googleization of Everything in 2011. He's written a lot about hacking, copyrights, the place of technology in American studies. He's just a broad minded, far seeing scholar who I think can be described as feral, even though he is within the confines of academia. What he most recently wrote about was the use of autonomous and AI directed or AI partially directed weapons being used in Iran. So this is very timely. I'm looking forward to talking to him.
Absolutely. I can't wait to jump in. It's been almost 20 years since I've seen him, so this will be really fun.
Okay, excellent. Siva, welcome to What Rough Beast. Siva, welcome to the show. It is so good to see you.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
Now, you
It's very
might not
exciting.
know this, but
Mm.
our show, formerly What Rough Beast, is now called Omni Shambles.
Ooh, I like that.
Yes.
We're pushing over into the mess and embracing it fully.
Exactly. Exactly. No more holding back. We're in the Omni Shambles. We want to talk to you about Omni Shambles in Iran in particular, and also stateside in the ongoing wrangling over what's going to happen with AI's use and misuse in war.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, that's what we're all thinking about these days. So,
Um, Talk us through this piece for the New Republic about
yeah.
who's deciding. What is the authorship as you put it, the
Oh boy.
author. Who is the
Yeah.
author of the bombs being dropped in Iran? And you
It's
say it
impossible
might
to
not.
know, right?
Yeah,
It's
go
impossible to
ahead,
know,
tell
right?
us.
So just like it's the impossible to know the author of whatever is on whatever news site you're pulling up these days, right? You don't
Mhm.
know what has been generated by machine and what has been generated by humans or what has been massaged by machine or massaged by humans. That's weird enough when we're dealing with language and we're dealing with learning. But imagine if we're dealing with life and death. Among my community of tech researchers, one of the things that's been driving us crazy for a number of years is the sort of misplaced attention when considering AI, when considering various forms of artificial intelligence. One, first of all, the whole like conflation of all forms of of artificial intelligence as one thing is a problem. But the focus has been on two things, right? Maybe two foci. One, this sort of the Matrix nightmare, the idea that the machines will take over and capture us and enslave us, blah, 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 the nightmare scenario, right?
Mhm.
And that is generally pushed by people who are almost fundamentalist about the potential for AI to be powerful. And then there is the hand wringing over whether students are cheating. I think both are misplaced concerns. One, we don't really have to face a nightmare scenario, a matrix scenario, because none of these machines are anywhere close to that. The obsession with whether students are cheating is missing the big picture. The question is whether we as a society can actually think. An extension of that is whether we choose to think about the things that really matter, whether, for instance, people are going to prison and for how long, or whether people are dying in explosions and how often, and whether the people we would prefer to die are dying, right? Which is a weird sentence, but unfortunately true. That's really what we should worry about because that's what's happening. The big problems with AI are present tense, that we use it or misuse it or abuse it for things like predictive policing, things like sentencing recommendations, and things like autonomous weapons or semi-autonomous weapons. In other words, weapons where the decision to launch it and the target might not be something generated by human deliberation, consideration, morality, etc.
Mhm.
So that's what we're dealing with here.
In this piece, you start with the BBC report. Now it's been much more widely reported that a girls' school in southern Iran was one of the first casualties, was one of the first structures to be destroyed in US and Israeli bombing of Iran. You take that instance as a moment where we need to start evaluating who's making decisions about
Right.
targets.
Yeah. So this isn't the first time that the US has used AI supplements, if not direction, in warfare. It was slowly built into our systems, our military systems, in the 10 years of the Afghan war, and largely led by Palantir as Palantir worked its way into the Pentagon, worked its way first into the Marine Corps, and then ultimately into the Army, displacing other operating systems that were intended to generate intelligence tips and analysis, like in the field. So that whole story was largely missed because, we stopped covering a 10-year war in about year 3.
Mhm.
So we missed this tremendous transition in how we're conducting that war.
And
That was
how did
yeah,
Palantir's technology, because as you say,
yeah.
we'll say autonomous about everything from tiny kids' drones to cars to Claude. So how was Palantir's technology being used in those
To the best of our
semi-automatic
knowledge,
weapons?
yeah, to the best of our knowledge, Palantir was not being used for what we might classify as autonomous weapons. In other words, weapons that sort of make their own decisions or are a system that targets a weapon without human intervention in Afghanistan. But
Mhm.
the whole process of deciding where to deploy troops, whom to interrogate, what doors to
Mm.
knock on, those questions were assisted by Palantir systems that ferret through vast collections of information. A lot of it is classified intelligence data. In other words, what used to take, and this is a standard AI line, what used to take human beings 72 hours now takes the Palantir operating system 3 or 4 minutes. And so the notion that this made military and intelligence decisions more efficient, quicker reacting, et cetera, probably holds up. Whether it made intelligent decisions qualitatively better is something that is impossible to measure.
Yeah, with that's why we did so well in Afghanistan,
Yeah,
clearly.
exactly. Right. Yeah, yeah. And again, like even in warfare, just because one side prevails doesn't mean that the other side did everything wrong. We just can't know. That's one of the maddening things about this, right? We make a huge set of decisions about something so crucial, and we have no way of accurately judging the effectiveness or the even the efficiency. We just see it happens faster, and we like that we can trust it. And that's the danger when we decide to depend on something and trust it so completely that we suspend or ignore our own judgment, or more importantly, and this I think is the key word to almost all of what we have to think about, the deliberative process. Because you really
Mhm.
do want, as we know, better decisions are made with a diverse group of people with different skills, backgrounds, and knowledge, looking at similar collections of facts and making predictions, analyses, and recommendations and
Yeah.
working it out. Now, that is a slow process. Deliberation is deliberate, as in all deliberate speed.
Mm.
And that can be maddening and sometimes deadly in a military situation. So, of course, we're not going to get full deliberation, but that doesn't mean we should have systems that exempt deliberation. And the more we depend on the speed and efficiency and ease of these systems, the worse our decision making will get over time.
I think it's interesting too in the way that these LLMs are architected. And I used to go up against Palantir in bids for I worked in aerospace, and so they have predictive maintenance features that are run on Foundry, which is like their foundational like data crunching platform.
Yeah.
And so we would kind of do a little espionage here and there and get inside of their PowerPoint decks and like attend some of their seminars. And so it was interesting the way that they were pitching this to asset maintenance is like very similar to the way they're pitching it in warfare. And the way they were organizing it, the machine learning component of it to see we can predict which components of your machine are going to break or
Right.
which types of inventory for parts you're going to need to stock. There were a lot of these similar promises. Now, I don't know how that's since gone from the machine learning portion of it to the generative AI portion of it,
Right.
which, if you look at the way that LLMs are actually architected, it's very concerning
Yeah.
because, and you'll probably get into this with Claude, but the base model doesn't change. You can put a layer on top of it for military awareness, which is like retrieval augmented generation or RAG. So you can
Hmm.
pull from like additional data, but that model only has what is available to it at training time. So that means that the Claude that you're accessing on your computer and asking whether to get orthodontia is the same one that the military is using, just with a different set of scrims on top.
That's right. That's right. And we have to question both, right? We have to question
Yes.
the model and its various weights. We have to question the training data and the
Yes.
context. One thing we do have a reasonable ability to guess about is that the current use of LLMs in the process of making intelligence decisions and making weapons targeting decisions has been fed on data collected by the military of Ukraine over the past few years, as Ukraine has basically opened itself up to be a laboratory of new technologies. That was one of the things it had to do in the scramble to become armed, defensively armed a few years ago. The government of Ukraine basically said to all of the military tech companies in the world, we will be your lab. You can run your tests. We will give the best guess we can as to how effective and deadly your weapons or your systems are when defending against Russian incursion. And of course, Russia is adept at developing these technologies and has its own collection of pet companies around the world that can feed similar technology. And so you have essentially an arms race of two laboratory systems going on in Ukraine, that has helped the US military gain both experience and confidence along with training data. And then we have 3 years of war in Gaza, which has
Mhm.
been very
War.
overtly directed by AI guidance systems. The Israeli government's been very open about that. And of course, apologizes profusely every time that civilians are killed. And they say, well, that was just a mistake or whatever. But then you really have to ask, given the high level of civilian casualties in the Gaza war, how good are these systems? How well are we training, and what are we training it on? And do we care about whether high numbers of civilians are dying if we have the excuse of blaming it on the machine?
We all remember the pictures of Ukrainian grannies with shotguns kind of going to the front and the idea that they were going to throw anything at Russia to protect their country. So you have a lot of leeway in there to try new technologies because it has a broad mandate. And in Gaza, whatever they say, clearly the idea of drive it back to rubble is in place for Israel. So you also have a lot of room. But with Iran, we don't know, obviously, we just don't know what the US and Israel are up to, what the end game is. We don't know what you would optimize autonomous weapons for. And when on day one, 150 children or mostly kids out of school are killed,
Yeah.
that's the kind of thing that when Obama, had one drone that hit part of a madrasa, there were, an outcry during the whole span of the war. These are
Yeah.
considered mistakes, no matter who, when they happen, no matter. So this would seem to be a catastrophic failure on day one of
True, true.
this new technology, and
On
yet we're
that,
not reading it that way.
I mean, unless those in charge don't consider it failure,
That's it.
which, given the moral state of the United States government, is not outlandish,
That's right.
right? You consider the fact that a president who has never felt empathy about anything or anyone has essentially blamed Iran for killing its own schoolgirls. Why did Iran wait until the war to kill its own school? And of course, this is the classic move of the extreme right, which is to say the most absurd thing, to put the rest of the reasonable world off its game. So we have to spend, as I have spent the last 6 or 7 seconds, dismissing absurdity. Like, that's a waste of time. It's a waste of my mind. And yet I've fallen for it. So great.
And if anyone, including Anthropic, who begins to propose that this isn't an excellent use of its technology, is dismissed as woke. I was just saying anything that is constitutional is woke, anything that might pass UN standards is now woke. The Geneva Convention was beyond woke. The Geneva Convention is basically like a land acknowledgement or Latin X for wokery. And then if all the way to is the Enlightenment woke, is the idea that children should not be killed in war woke.
That's right.
Yes. And all of those things are
sort
what
of instant rhetorical dismissal.
Yes. Anthropic is now, according to Elon Musk, an enemy of Western civilization because it refuses to submit its technology to this completely reckless war.
And yet it does and did and is, right? So Anthropic is still being used by the military and will be for at least 6 months, because the White House has given the military 6 months to replace it. Whether it can replace it with OpenAI or with XAI is another question, because who knows whether anybody in the Pentagon or the White House is going to be consistent on this matter. That seems to me to be just a basic shakedown to once again favor a company that has expressed loyalty and all sorts of other horrible values against a company that won a bid, right? And won a bid because the Pentagon decided it had the quality product. No, but let's not let Anthropic off the hook for making what is not necessarily a moral pronouncement, right? It can be pitched as a moral pronouncement that Anthropic doesn't want its technology used for 2 purposes. One, mass surveillance of American citizens. Hey, that's great, but what about the rest of the world? What about immigrants? What about people at the border, right? Obviously, they have no such moral concern for human beings. It is simply about the legal concern of US citizens. Secondly, its system should not be used for autonomous weapons. Now, does that mean partially autonomous weapons or fully autonomous weapons? Because we don't have fully autonomous weapons yet, at least as far as we know. But also, that's not exactly a moral statement because it's couched in capability terms. What Anthropic is saying is that LLMs and Claude specifically are not precise enough to be counted on for life and death decisions. That's a reasonable statement. It is a true statement. It is a basic engineering statement. Great. We all know it. If we've ever tried to like look up a citation generated by an LLM, we know that for sure. But that's not exactly a moral position, right? That's more of a technical engineering sort of statement. Like, it's not good enough. Does that mean it will never be good enough? Well, a lot of us who look at LLMs say those sorts of errors are sort of necessary to the technology. And others, like those who run Anthropic, are quite idealistic about the potential of constant improvement. So Anthropic, when it got this $200 million contract, had to have known that its systems would be not only used, but abused, because that's warfare.
And I think
Uh,
another element of the way that LLMs operate, and probably one of the things that they're concerned with in addition to the legality aspect, is the outputs that you get are probabilistic. So
Yes.
they're not able
mhm,
to actually look at a problem in depth and see unlikely outcomes for something. And so they're
Exactly.
always going to go like water downhill, and they're going to flow into the most likely solution to a problem.
Right.
And if, let's say, that is like, kill this person autonomously, but that, so, oh, well, I'm sorry, they were the most likely target for this bomb. Like,
mm,
it's
Right.
just like,
Based
and
on
then
historical
what?
data. So
yeah.
look, perhaps roll back to, 1913, 14, or roll back to 38 and imagine Claude advising the French government on its defenses. It would tell the French government to do exactly what the French government did in both wars, because that was the likely way to defend against intrusion from the East. And yet we know that it was the unlikely that happened
Mm,
because human
And it
beings
often
respond.
is, right, in
Exactly.
war,
And
right? It's the
mm,
unlikely outcomes that actually change the direction of things. And
that's right.
equally, the more you feed it from the past, the more it's like a neuronal adaptation where you ingrain a habit, you're that much more likely to do the habit again next time. And it's that
Right.
much harder to break out of it. So it's like
Right.
the
Right.
object, the salience of that becomes so much more obvious to it
Yeah.
that it completely, like, all the data that's out there in the point cloud is just hanging on, flapping on in the edges there with like not even connected to the center.
And
So it's
I'm
actually,
yeah.
these are terrible machines for making
Well,
really high stakes
right.
I
decisions.
I'm no neuroscientist. That sounds to me like the opposite of intelligence. It sounds
Yes.
like doubling down, which is clearly stupidity in its own form.
Well, Siva,
Mm, yeah.
You've done a lot of thinking about thinking, especially when it comes to education and pedagogy. And you used a word that Elaine Scarry uses in her great book 2011, Thinking in an Emergency, which I love. I
Yeah.
highly recommend to everyone, including our listeners. Deliberation.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of deliberation, but what artificial deliberativeness might be.
Yeah.
Is it possible? And also, what is deliberation? It's such a
Oh, that's
great
good.
word,
Okay.
right? And the idea that
So
it takes time.
as we've seen democracy get dismantled, and you and I have been, talking about this for more than a decade now in various
Tedious
forms and
decade, yep.
various media spaces,
Yes.
with various actors dismantling democracy around the world. I've had a decade to think about what we really should mean about democracy, because it can't just mean we all get to vote and our votes count. That is the bare minimum. But how does one support democracy culturally? How does one support democracy morally? How does one support democracy in terms of process? How does one get a society to believe in the fact that one can lose an election and still play the game because you believe the game is fair going forward? And I found myself digging into two concepts that are not often explored deeply in democratic theory. One is deliberation, which there is a wing of democratic theory that is very much about deliberative democracy. James Fishkin at Stanford is
Mhm.
sort of the biggest voice in saying that what counts as democratic is this process of a diverse group of people with different stakes, and not just stakeholders, but interested parties engaging with fair rules and a common sense of respect to plot a path forward. And again, be willing to lose a vote or
Mhm.
lose a decision or lose an argument because it's okay, I get another chance and it'll all be fair. That is deliberative democracy as a theory comes in and out of fashion. Right now, it's very out of fashion. It's
Mhm.
just not something people are taking seriously enough. But the other thing I've been thinking about is accountability. Why do we have a First Amendment? We don't have a First Amendment so we can watch porn. That's an afterthought. We don't have a First Amendment so that we can use 4-letter words in various contexts. Again, that's a nice thing, I guess. We have a First Amendment to ensure accountability on our elected leaders and appointed leaders. That's why the
Mhm.
right to petition our government and the right to assemble are part of the First Amendment too. Those
Mhm.
are about accountability. Those are about holding those in power to account. And what we have seen pretty systematically for the last decade, I actually would trace it back almost 50 years, is the removal of accountability from major areas of American life. Think about the financial crisis in 2008, largely caused by the fact that we socialize risk and privatize gain. And
Mm.
our entire financial regulatory system since the days of Bill Clinton has been shifting toward that, where we all pay for
Mm.
the losses
Mhm.
and those who take the risks end up winning regardless and then getting bailed out, right?
Mhm.
But you can extend that now to political corruption, where there is no accountability for political corruption. You can extend
Mhm.
it to war crimes, where one of the first things that Trump did when he came into office the second time was pardon everybody who had been convicted of a war crime in
Right.
Afghanistan or
Yep.
Iraq. I mean, that just basically sends a message that anything goes. And in
I
fact,
mean,
we won't respect you if you try to enforce the basic rules by which the armed forces are sworn to behave.
I think that was Hegseth's first proof of influence on Trump was that he got him to pardon Eddie Gallagher, just
That's right.
a war criminal of the highest order. His bloodthirsty discussions of what this war means to him. He doesn't even nod to. I think I wrote in the New Republic today. We at least don't have to be bored with the bullshit of neocons. Like, we don't hear anything about stability in the region or even oil. There's no domino effect. There's no Kissinger. There's no secular
Right.
explanation of why you have to
It,
do this.
it's
And there's
almost
no
refreshing in its lack of
That's
grand
right.
theory.
Right, exactly. Or even its lack of all that, like Paul Wolfowitz, like you were just supposed to, or WMDs, or you were just supposed to pay enormous amounts of attention to kind of State Department palaver about this and that. We don't get any of that.
Right.
There's no mansplaining because they're not splaining anything, and
Yeah.
and then we also don't have Condoleezza Rice and George Bush talking about capital F freedom or making the world safe for democracy or liberating women who've suffered under under Khomeini. None of that, right? So at least we're not getting any bullshit. But the bloodthirstiness in Hegseth is so hard to watch. It's
Yeah.
it's vice signaling. He's obviously a huge fan of the Crusades. He wants to relive the Crusades, but everything in response to someone saying, well, it sounds like a lot of casualties. It looks like he's like on fire with
Yeah.
lust to just wipe people out. Americans too, by the way.
Well, how many Americans is another question. There's always going to be a
Yes.
decent sized group of Americans who are bloodthirsty and hate people of other colors and other religions. That's just, but
Yeah.
that's true everywhere in the world. But the fact that Americans are almost immediately seeing the cost of this, and so many families are still scarred by the 10 years of war in Afghanistan
Hmm.
and the 7 years of war in Iraq, and are exhausted and don't want anything more to do with these sorts of shenanigans, and seeing the cost at the pump, which should be the least, concerning of our costs, but it's there, it's visible, and it is something people care about. But this administration, this Trump administration, as opposed to the last Trump administration, has been completely stripped of anyone who might slow down the gears, who
Hmm.
might raise an objection, who might slow walk insanity, who might wait the next 24 hours to see if the president
Yes.
forgets what he said the day before. I think we were all snide about when they decided to serve Trump in the first term, but I think we can all be grateful to them because who knows what might have happened with
Yeah,
the current band of people working for Trump the first time. But that, look, they all learned
absolutely
their
right.
lesson. They're like, we're going to strip everybody out who has any sense of decency and process and legality. We're going to get rid of all of the inspectors general. We are
Mhm.
just going to rain terror and corruption down through every instrument of the federal government.
Yep.
And by the way, this interrogation I'm getting into with the military and intelligence use of AI is just one part of a larger story I want to tell about the importing or imposition or installation of AI throughout the federal bureaucracy, which is basically what Doge was all about. It
Mm,
was
mhm.
strip out humans and any sense of expertise and judgment under the guise of saving money, which it won't, of course, nobody's saving any money, and then installing unaccountable, inscrutable, opaque systems that might or might not be provided by XAI. We don't know that either. Nonetheless, somebody's going to be influencing, if not controlling, these machines that decide whether you get your social security check on time. And that is terrifying in its own sense. Again, the lack of accountability. So,
Mhm.
I'm writing a book about AI and democracy, and I'm basically saying, hey, yeah, everybody's worried about deep fakes, and I'm not saying they're not a problem, but they're not anywhere near the problem of having housing policy decided by AI. Right? That is a much more serious problem.
I just want to close the loop on deliberation. I mean, not close it, but for now, close it. I was thinking while you were talking about a sermon I heard from a rabbi maybe 10 years ago about why people keep kosher. And
Uh-huh.
it was amazing. I don't know if it was as moving to other people present as it was to me, but I always come back to it. He said, "You don't not eat this kind of meat and only eat this kind of meat just to have strict laws. You do it to put a brake on your zeal
Yes.
around
Yes.
meat,"
Oh
right?
my gosh, yes.
And it's brilliant. And
Yes.
it had never occurred to me because my father's Catholic, I grew up not eating meat on Fridays, and it always seemed like this sort of absurd conceit. But just the
Yes.
time it takes to say, "Oh, what day of the week is it? I'm gonna have where I guess we have fish tonight." Or, if you're kosher, deciding, "Oh, we do eat pork, we don't eat this." Now, if you plug it into an AI, this is only about making those fine distinctions. It's not about
Right.
putting a brake on zeal. You optimize for something, and the brakes are bad. Like the
Yeah.
thing that you said about what's great about decision making to people when they're intelligence gathering in Afghanistan. What's great about AI is how quickly and does in 15 minutes what humans would do in 70 days. The point is the 70 days.
Right.
The
Right.
point is the brake on the
Yeah.
zeal.
I mean, this is what
Um,
I've been thinking about this very question, and so I have to say, like, I'm a very pro-religion atheist because of
yeah.
this. When you think about the institutions that actually help us live better lives, so many of them are designed to put the brakes on or defer gratification.
Mm,
And deferred gratification is really important as we try to teach every child. And if
mhm.
we don't defer gratification, we don't mature. And if we don't mature individually, we're in trouble. And if
Yeah.
we don't mature as a society, we're in bigger trouble.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
we have institutions like institutions of higher learning and institutions like museums and institutions like Chautauquas, institutions like magazines and books, institutions like temples, synagogues, mosques, and churches because they're not supposed to be fast and fun.
Yeah.
Christian rock sucks because it's trying to be fast and fun.
Oh,
What
yeah.
really matters in the process of worship is the quiet
Mm,
connection with others and with a higher being. That is what is nutritious about that set of rituals. That's not to say that the groove isn't important and the gospel music isn't important and the clapping of hands and the speaking in tongues. They're all important rituals as well, but they are also about delayed gratification in a sense because they are beyond the corporeal. They are outside this world.
yeah.
It's one of the reasons why people so immersed and brought up in the gospel tradition are suspicious of rhythm and blues because, oh my gosh, now you're bringing it to the corporeal.
Yeah.
But like that's why we need all of the above. We need the
Mhm.
corporeal. We need the passionate. We need the immediate. But we also need the mediated. We need the patient, the deliberative. We need delayed gratification to make the gratification sweeter, if for no
Mm,
other reason.
mhm.
I have no idea what that has to do with autonomous weapons in
No,
Iran, but
it absolutely does. I mean, if someone at the top said very simply, because I feel like one of the things this administration lacks is just someone doing a kind of vibe check, just a very simple, like, it's kind of weird the way Pete Hegseth talks about murdering people with licking his chops. Just, it's kind of weird. And that's what I think the rabbi would have us do, saying, like, when you're really looking forward to having a bloody steak and eating an animal every night, there's something a
yeah,
little weird about it. Just so small and simple, and yet we don't even hear any of that. Anyway,
right,
Sai,
right.
like, you can get down a
No,
little more
hey,
brass
I mean,
tacks
we're
on the
totally on
technology.
the same wave about this, and that's why, like, when it comes to waging war or making decisions within war, this is the challenge. And everybody who is a professional warrior who is seriously trained understands that this is the tension
Mhm,
between the demand for immediacy and addressing a situation unfolding in front of you and the demand for the greater good or the greater story. The difference between a decision in the moment or the day and the grand strategy and goals of the action itself
mhm,
are often in tension. You send UN troops into Rwanda in 1996 to try to stop genocide, to stop bloodshed. But along the way, you have to kill people you would rather not kill in order
mhm,
to do that, right? That sense of what is the right balance to strike, what is the best way to do your best, knowing you can never do all for good. Those are the deep moral questions, which is why we like our officers to be deeply knowledgeable. We like them to
mhm,
read Herodotus. We like them to read Socrates. We like them to think about legal history, military history, diplomatic history. We like them to learn multiple languages
mhm.
because we know that ultimately they are in positions to make these decisions that hundreds or thousands of lives can be changed in a day with a bad decision. And we want to be able to trust them.
An interesting thing to return to in the corporeal or in the situated,
Yeah.
because again, these technologies have no ability to situate themselves in a embodied consciousness, nor are they
Right.
conscious. I don't care what anyone says
I
about that.
know,
They are not
right?
conscious. We don't know what consciousness is. It's not that.
Right.
Like,
We know what
there's
it's not.
the way that they look at that they see the world is the world that is created for them is like a snow globe a little bit. It's the traces of things that have passed through the corporeal world, and they're decoding and then re-encoding because they don't read language. They don't understand human language. Everything is in, these internal codes, these token IDs. So they're only able to see the traces of what's past, and from that determine a probabilistic future
Yeah.
based on the frozen world that they're constantly shaking that snow globe, and it's reconstituting the probabilities. And so when you're talking about deliberation or embodied experience of what does it mean when I punch this button and I launch that missile and it kills X number of people, and I have to live with that, and my community has to live with that.
Yeah.
That's part of the reason why these tools are they're like a siren song for the
Yeah.
people who don't want accountability, because
Right.
you're outsourcing the accountability to the model. And it's literally
Mhm.
like, well, it's not even like we're just following orders. It's,
Yeah.
well, the model was just following orders.
Mm.
I
So
don't know.
the roots of this habit of thought, the roots of this current AI moment are in the mid 1950s, or actually early 1950s, with the rise of cybernetics,
Exactly.
with this
Old
notion of,
Norbert Wiener.
yeah, well,
Old Norbert
Love
the
that
and
guy.
which came directly out of the process of missile targeting and bomb
Mhm.
targeting in
Ashby.
World War II. Not to mention the notion of how one might aim an anti-aircraft
Mhm.
missile at an aircraft that is moving and has a pilot making decisions on literally on the fly, right?
Mhm.
That
Absolutely.
problem, that seemingly inscrutable math problem, turns out not to be a good math problem. It turns out to be a process of constant iterative guessing toward a better result, and machine learning ultimately. And that is where we get cybernetics, and ultimately where we get machine learning. And I actually wrote a paper that I delivered at Georgetown Law last week, in which I make this connection rather explicitly between what Rand Corporation was arguing in the
Mm.
1950s and 60s about the winnability of nuclear war under the right conditions with acceptable losses, which to me is the most, I call it vulgar utilitarianism. It's utilitarianism in the absence of any other value. It is not a utilitarianism that John Stuart Mill would recognize. It's a utilitarianism that is not toward human ends. It is toward mathematical optimization. And that's essentially what we have now embedded into every area of life. It started out with bomb targeting and questions about whether we could survive a nuclear war and under what conditions. And now it's in our banking system, in our insurance companies, in our educational software. It's how we look up our symptoms on the web, and it is in our military and intelligence systems through and through.
And I find it so mind-bending that mechanistic thinking, everyone that came up with those concepts, it ruined their lives.
Right. And they would argue against it if they were alive today.
And they absolutely not arguing against it. I mean, Norbert Wiener is the case in point for that specifically, but like there's not one among them who came out of that saying, oh, thank goodness I did this to the world. Like we were talking suicides and drug addictions and divorces and children who won't talk to their parents. I mean, it's just a storyline that's littered with corpses on the side of the road.
I don't know if you two remember like the flurry of reaction from Silicon Valley leaders to Oppenheimer, the movie. They were all like, we'll never have another great Oppenheimer because we're not studying science in this country. And I was just like, you didn't really watch the end of the movie, did you?
That's well, Jeffrey Epstein opened his eugenics ranch near Los Alamos for a reason. He wanted his project to be another Manhattan Project.
All the wrong lessons from Douglas Adams, all the wrong lessons from Isaac Asimov, all the wrong lessons from biographies like Oppenheimer. Right? Yeah, it's like finish the book, please.
But I think it's not incidental what Sai just said about the drug addiction and the way these stories end. I'm sorry to drag us into Epstein again. Although, it seems to be the never-ending story. But let's say that you have this most powerful man on earth, but you're just watching him, you're just watching him from a helicopter, watching his life. He died by hanging at 66, and he spent a bunch of time in jail, and he couldn't somehow get the women he was attracted to sleep with him, so he had to rape them and coerce them. This is not creature success. And if Elon Musk is supposed to be a great creature success, who's not, who's hugely reproductive success, one of his daughters loathes him and despises him.
At least one,
right? And the ones over 5 are probably moving toward hating him too, and has a drug addiction, and has described serious mental health problems, suicidal ideation. So what seems crazy to me, and this somehow I'm going to try to loop this back to the school, but there are 150 plus dead bodies in and around a school, and this is supposed to be the test run for the greatest technology ever made. You can't imagine. Sai has written so beautifully about the collision between the kind of procedural world up here and the bodies of the girls destroyed by Epstein down here that live in the space where it's important if you're bleeding, or if it's important if you are bruised, or if you're hurt, or if you're suicidal, and then this other world where it isn't. And now those things are so detached from each other. You have people waging this war who are talking about Armageddon and Book of Revelation and some complete sci-fi nonsense to justify optimizing these semi-autonomous weapons to do this thing that looks a lot like a massacre that, would have been pulled off in the most brutal times in human history, that looks like it should have been done by machetes, by people who had lost their minds. So this is this great realization all of philosophy has tunneled down into: a lamb with 7 eyes coming to judge us from the lake of fire, or whatever is in Revelation. Okay, that's where philosophy has led us. And all of human engineering has led us to the first strike on an enemy, leading to the slaughter of children. Clearly,
the punch button massacre.
Punch button massacre. I mean, punch button, exactly. Or even maybe they don't even need to punch the button because, if your description is right.
Well, now we're getting to the point where we don't need to even punch the button.
Infinite regress into who's the author of these things. But anyway, it just looks like to even the most greedy, the person who just wants maximum money, bring down oil prices, stay in power, whatever evil motives we might assign to people, even
Right.
those seem missing. It really
Yeah.
seems like this like sci-fi video game, I don't know, a book
I mean, I
Battlefield Earth.
miss
Well, I never read Battlefield Earth. I bet it's like this, you know?
I miss the legible motivations like greed. You know,
Yes.
greed was a stay on a certain amount of madness.
Yes.
I spent my younger years in Texas when you could always count on Texas Republicans keeping the crazies in line because Texas Republicans cared about the bottom line in those days more than anything. So public schools were supposed to be good. Universities were supposed to be like places of free discourse and excellent research. We didn't want overt racism in Texas because Texas Instruments wasn't enough. You needed IBM and 3M and Apple to come to Texas as well. Right? And they weren't going to come if the worst versions of Texas were visible. And that was, for all of their sins, the great virtue of Texas Republicans in those days, that they would keep the crazies in line until the crazies overwhelmed them. In classic form of conservatives thinking they could keep radicals, fascists, and Christian nationalists in line and then failing. I kind of miss the good old greed. I kind of miss the notion that they're actually after it to be rich. In fact, a lot of like public arguments that I have or spats I have like on Blue Sky and other places, like people will say, well, he's just in it for the money. And I'm like, yeah, you don't get like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, they have so much money, they don't care about money.
Right.
They're not in it for the money. They're in it to mess with people and to influence people and control people and brutalize people. They are sadists fundamentally.
Well, and I think they're trying to actually be superhuman. I mean, I think they are angered by the fact that they are subject to the same slings and arrows that the rest of us are.
Accountability.
And if they could, they would
limitations,
absolutely,
Right.
And if they could, they would actually just take their brain
That's
and
right.
put it into
everything
an AI
Elon
that
Musk
make
has
it,
done has been to elude any sense of limitation or accountability in his entire
to
life.
escape.
Right. And he knows that if he
They're
gets rich
obsessed with it.
enough, if he buys enough politicians, if he controls enough platforms, he can limit accountability. If he can get his hands in the federal government and strip out the bureaucrats who are trying to regulate Tesla, then he gets what he wants. And that's exactly what happened.
But that's the thing, is like no matter how much power and money and death and destruction and suffering that these people cause, they are still gonna die.
Right. Right. That's why
They can't buy their way out of that yet.
And live miserably. Right?
And in the process.
I know. I mean, the thing is, I love this point about Texans, because you're absolutely right. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between Ahab and Starbuck in Moby Dick. And if you remember, we all remember Ahab's monomaniac. We know that he decides basically to just give up the Pequod's mission, which is a commercial oil, Texas oil man style mission to bring back a certain amount of whale oil. And Starbuck just keeps saying to him, like, stick to the mission. You're supposed to make this money, and not even mission, stick to the commercial project of this thing. There is dollar signs at the other end. And
They
Ahab
signed a contract.
Yes, exactly. You have a contract. And Ahab just keeps saying, nope. Eep or Google gobble. We're just going to go after Moby Dick, blah, blah, and barking mad. And that's where I feel like Dick Cheney went down a semi-hero or semi-redeemed, at least because you just thought, this guy is not pinwheel-eyed. He he's looking out for number one, and he might even have some, he probably has obligations to family, and he might even have obligations to country, but it adds up.
Yeah. And
he's not simply a lunatic, which is like what we see in Musk, in Zuckerberg, in the rogues Mount Rushmore that still has its boot on our throat. That probably mixes metaphors because we've got them made of stone, but you know what I mean. The idea that philosophical traditions have turned into this complete fragmented 4chan nonsense is just something I'll never understand how it happened. Well, you told me a long time ago that Mark Zuckerberg's chief problem, because I was wondering about Facebook's moral responsibility, and I interviewed you about this for Wired, because not to take us too far afield, M dash. There, I had looked into the engineer for the World Trade Towers had taken enormous moral responsibility for their demise. No one else thought he was responsible, but he believed that had he made one small change, he would have given people an extra few seconds to escape. And he wrote poetry about this at the end of his life.
Yeah.
Anyway, I wondered if any of our engineers would do that. And I was leaving open the possibility that Zuckerberg, who was in this big mea culpa mode, might do it. So I called Siva and said, what do you think about engineers taking responsibility like Oppenheimer? And Siva, you said he lacks the moral imagination. He lacks the education.
Right.
He's
Right.
He's not a builder.
No, right.
well,
There is
he's
that
also
too.
not a
He's
builder.
an
He's also not a
operator.
builder,
Yeah.
but he hasn't. I mean,
Yeah.
it probably to become a builder, he would have needed more education. But I mean, he
Yes.
hasn't read a book, a simple book.
Right. Well, and the other thing is he thinks he has a moral imagination. I mean, Zuckerberg truly believes that the more people use Facebook, the better the world will be. And he believes that his experiment in social engineering is deeply beneficial to people. He has not been shaken by that belief, despite the human cost all around him. He thinks, again, greatest good for the greatest number over time will come from connections where people are able to engage in a frictionless communicative environment. Well, there is friction, but it's all friction on his choices. He believes that we're less likely to hate each other if we get to know each other, not looking at Jerusalem at any point, I think, right? Where neighbors tend to hate each other. I don't know. So he has a really simplistic sense. He has a childish sense of morality, a childish sense of a vision for humanity, a childish sense of the social, thoroughly uncomplicated by history, philosophy, or for that matter, religion.
I think, Virginia, to go back to the boat metaphor, I was recently rereading that Roland Barthes, just like little sketch on the Nautilus and the Drunken Boat, which is, he's writing about Jules Verne.
Oh, I haven't
And
even read
he's
that one.
talking about how Jules Verne uses the symbol of the ship as a way to sort of escape and to like eschew the responsibilities of being in the world. That it's ultimately, he's not using the ship as a metaphor that's a mature metaphor. And I couldn't help but think of that in terms of the LLMs and the way that these, a lot of the people who are building these models are coming from a platform logic, and the men who have built these platforms build them as walled gardens. And there's a sentence in there that it just has stuck with me for my whole life, and I don't know why, but it's something along the lines of he situated himself there in the place where all the instruments of man were lined up together, and everything was together. He had everything he needed. He didn't have to leave the ship. I just get the sense that this is what they're all trying to do. They're trying to create these tiny walled environments that no one will ever have to go outside of these things to have everything they need, and that they get to draw the contours around the magic circle, the world, where we never can get outside of it. Suddenly we are only in their world. And that's what these models are doing as well, even though the models themselves are architected in such a way that there's no way that will ever work. It's the same as like with Facebook. It's like, how could you possibly think that connecting with people while it's all mediated by advertising is a good idea? Like, that's going to solve the world's problems?
When I picture that room that you talked about, and maybe Siva, you can speak to this because you understand better than I do, but what does a situation room look like right now? I mean, right? We aren't seeing Hillary Clinton and Obama and people whose intelligence we respect looking at screens with creased eyes. Like I don't know.
I'm pretty sure it's at Mar-a-Lago if it exists at all.
It's Twitter.
It's Twitter, or it's some kind of screening room at Mar-a-Lago where they go back and forth between Fox News and drone strikes. I don't know.
It's a situationship room.
It's just oh my God. Oh, okay. We have a title for the episode. But I mean, is where are these semi-autonomous weapons? How are they being orchestrated? Are these like kids in drone rooms, or are they? Yeah.
Well, so we can't know exactly. I think we have a pretty good guess by looking at what we have seen in Ukraine and in Gaza, that some of these weapon systems are operated in the field. They're operated. How much of a field do we have in Iran? As far as we know, we don't have troops there. We might soon, or we probably have some special forces we are not allowed to know about. They probably have drones and other sorts of weapons that are their first time using them. We do know that Central Command is a place where decisions are made. We know that there are headquarters in Qatar and Kuwait, as well as Florida, that make important life or death decisions at the strategic level.
Mhm.
And there are rooms in Las Vegas where Air Force officers are making decisions about where to unleash bombs and missiles. We will never know what the CIA does. We know that under Obama, the CIA developed a really deadly weapons system that operated outside of military rules. And I think we're probably haven't really come to terms with any of that and what that means that the CIA, a non-military organization, a civilian organization, is authorized to kill people. So we'll probably never really have a full sense of it. There is a flock of the world's best military and intelligence journalists out there. I mean, we know some of the best ones, and I know they're hard at work trying to crack this and describe the situation. But this war is definitely different from Afghanistan, although it builds on Afghanistan.
Oof. Your mention of Las Vegas, even though I know you're talking about actual military operations, also reminds me that there's a layer of poly market at play here, and
Oh,
probably
boy.
DraftKings betting on casualties, and who seem to have known about the strikes before we did.
Right. And the House
So
always wins.
the house always wins, exactly. You gotta
Let
take
it
us to
let
a
it
happy
loose.
place. Yeah, or
Take it to
drive
a
it into the
happy
ground.
place?
Yeah.
Let it roll.
Or you're just so happy with your situationship room. You don't need to bring anything
No,
more.
trying not to like make us roll over into tomorrow. To go back to what we were talking about the lack of a situated consciousness, the lack of an embodied viewpoint, the lack of a unitary viewpoint for these models. They're not time bound either, which is so interesting because they don't actually exist within a vector of time. So it's like you can't even describe this as a sort of consciousness. If it's consciousness at all, it would be episodic because it's only called into being through a query, which is just like a really weird way to think of it. I'm now writing about this in terms of my theory is that like content, like the telos of content is slop. If you take a look at our lived environment, which is completely permeated by extractive capitalism, and that's our life world, and you say, here's all the data, glump, about this life world. Now make predictions based on this. Well, what are you going to get? You're going to get strip malls like the one that's 3 blocks away from me, despite the fact that my house was built in 1859, where you are completely you lack any situatedness because you were only in the streams of mobile capital at that point. And these models were trained on massive amounts of content, right? Which is like pre-slop. So how can you expect anything else from these models? Like, it's not their fault. It's the way that the technology is actually architected.
They're not bad. They're drawn that way.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yes, that's right.
They're Jessica Rabbit.
They're Jessica Rabbit. Yeah, I mean, Siva, this goes to your students cheating on tests. I've written some about the AI that plays this game, Diplomacy. And what I learned when AI started beating humans at diplomacy, there was some suggestion that the AI could now pass the Turing test, an old idea that diplomacy is the most human game. But what I learned is that diplomacy had changed so much that the people playing it could no longer pass the Turing test, which I think is what Sai's getting at. The game changes so much in making content. You're so optimized for algorithms, you might as well be making zeros and ones. And when it comes to students, if they're just trying to approximate writing as well as a computer, which we did. And I remember in 7th grade learning this bing bong bango method of writing essays, right? With like 3 parts and this and that. That would, I mean,
Very
it had
algorithmic,
very algorithmic. I would advise a kid in 5th grade, if he was learning that method, to have ChatGPT do it, because he's just on a continuum with what a computer can do. And he's only doing it well or poorly on that axis. And what this is exactly, I think, what Sai's describing with content. Once you're already making optimized content, and by the way, this is why I think shows like this one, long shows, books that are so unoptimized. God help us when we try to corral this to fit the algorithm. Trying to make math of it is actually quite difficult. This is why I think those things stand as some break on our zeal, or at least break on the algorithm, formal ways that you slow things down, make them more deliberative, make them more human, as opposed to just trying to guess at what ChatGPT will always do better than we do.
Or faster.
Or faster. It won't stutter. We could probably have
You can
ChatGPT.
ask it to stutter, actually.
You can ask it to stutter. But I mean, it would be hard to have ChatGPT reproduce this conversation for all its
One thing you
accidents,
can never have it do,
Yes.
surprise itself.
Right. Right.
That is a world without surprise, and it is a world that cannot learn. That's why they can't be
Yeah.
creative.
Yeah. Yeah. And a surprise is obviously such an important part of warfare. That's sort of the thing that you were
Mhm.
talking about, Siva, with early missiles that were supposed to be able to anticipate or create a probability for where human pilot was
Right.
going to fly. And you can't do that because that person's trying to outthink you, and also someone operating from a position of adrenaline and surprise is acting differently than a computer that is behaves on probabilities. I mean, I do like this idea that once you've called it content, once you've made it into content and not novels and not classes and not whatever, that you're three-quarters of the way to AI already. And there are probably lots of things in the world like that. Warfare is like that, right? I mean, one of the things a million years ago that Fareed Zakaria said about drone warfare, you're expected to have skin in the game when you
Right.
fight a war and risk casualties, or
Yeah.
else you make very different decisions. Because it seems for now we don't have, quote, boots on the ground. I hate that expression, but anyway, in Iran, we are also not risking anything, and
Yes.
thus probably much more promiscuous with how many people we kill.
Yeah, we learned the wrong lessons from Vietnam. The lessons that the
Yeah.
military took from Vietnam was that, first of all, a draft creates a military that resents being there
Mhm.
and is unwieldy, unruly, disobedient, and often drug addicted. So they said, we never want that again. We never want a draft again. And they got what they wanted. Beyond that, they recognized that in future wars, if you expose a smaller and smaller portion of the American public to actual warfare, you can maintain political support longer. And that's exactly what they've designed. You look at the military, strategic, and arms acquisition choices of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. They were all about creating this remote control warfare, distancing the people who are fighting from the front, along with privatizing very significant portions of the military, including supply lines, et cetera. And so
Mhm.
making certain people rich, favored people rich. But along the way, risking fewer American lives sounds like a good thing. But it also means we're more likely to be reckless in our actions around the world. And that's exactly what we've seen this century. It took 20 years to get to the point of high recklessness, but that's basically where we are.
Where we are. Thank you so much, Siva, for being here on Omni Shambles.
Yeah, I love the title.
All right, we'll come back very soon.
Anytime.
It would be lovely.